Hello, going to do a video on just some, I've mentioned this kind of chart a couple times. This is one of the main tools I use for deciding what to expect from my skaters in competition and let them know what they should expect from themselves, let the parents know what to expect. But it generally, skaters preparing for events generally fall into a couple broad categories. So I'm going to go over some of the broad categories and maybe mention some people that are in those categories in order to just give people a better idea of how these patterns unfold. So, as I've said, and this is my third video doing this, over time, you end up doing run-throughs of your solos, and I'm not going to go through all the training methods and coaching methods I use for that. That's, first of all, I don't want it to be public knowledge. And second of all, changes depending on the person and the event and the kind of results you're planning to get. The whole process of training a solo changes. But most of my students right now are non-competitive students. You have to check my videos on definitions to figure out why, and kind of follow roughly the same training methods, so it kind of goes the same way. So what I do is essentially about, I kind of keep mental track of how good their solos are for maybe the last 10, 20, 30 solos before they compete, the last 3 to 4, 5 weeks before they compete. And I make note of what their worst solo is, what their best solo is, and generally where they get placed in between. And in my last video I mentioned that there was generally, you expect their average solo. Okay, that doesn't work at all. Back to purple or black. You expect their average solo to be somewhere in the middle, but that's actually not the case for a couple reasons that I'm about to go into. So case number one, which is generally, let's say, the way most people develop a solo, most skaters develop a solo under the methods I use, is they tend to, you start with, let's assume the solo is done 3, 4, 5 months ahead of time. So by the time we actually start taking a mental note of how good the quality of their solos each run through they do is, the choreography is pretty much set. What tends to happen, so the minimum would be not the worst solo they've ever done, but the worst solo they've ever done with their completed solo in the last couple months. And then the best solo, which generally you would start at. And then you generally move, depending on how long you've had the solo, generally you kind of fluctuate a bit and go up and down, and they might have a bad day where they're sick or injured or something, but generally it evens off in kind of a near the top. Actually, you should actually hit the top since their best solo has to be in there somewhere. And I say the average should be around here, but you can see that generally through time, and this is the majority of kids, they'll be, even though it fluctuates up and down, the solo generally gets better and better and better and better and better, unless there are significant factors involved like injuries, illness, major problems in school, major family problems, problems with friends being bullied, equipment problems, various other issues, but even that doesn't really affect this. Generally it gets better and better. So most of the time, my students, if they're averaging the last couple solos, if they're going right near the top range, I kind of expect that to be where their solo is going to be in competition, exactly where that is. Now, there is a slight adjusting factor where some kids skate slightly better in performances, some kids perform worse, some kids perform the same. So there is going to be a slight fluctuation on both sides, which you can kind of predict after you've had some exposure to the kid over several events. You get to know pretty consistently who is inconsistent, who stays about the same, who goes up and who goes down. For instance, I mentioned that Becky currently right now always skates better in competition than she normally does. Jessica generally skates exactly what I expect her to do, or really close to it every time. Same with Madison so far. I don't really have anyone right now that skates worse, although, again, some of that might be attributed to me and not just the fact that I got lucky and got 7 people who can compete at the moment. It's really hard to say what exactly this is attributed to, except that over time my kids always tend to do well in competition, which means some of it has to be coming from me. As much as parents want to attribute and other coaches want to attribute it completely to having talented kids. If it happens year after year after year for 20 years, it's got to be partly the coach. So this is kind of the normal model, which I would say applies to 40-50% of the kids I teach. I have some kids, and the only one I can think of off the top of my head is my last competitive kid, Emily, in Labrador, who didn't really fluctuate all that much. She kind of just, I'm going to erase this. So this is type number 2, and this is very rare, I think. Although I had a lot of lesson time with Emily, so that might have helped me predict her results. But what Emily would basically do is we'd start at the bottom, and there'd be, like, we'd fine-tune things, and it would basically follow a completely consistent pattern where about a month before an event, she'd be doing mostly max solos, max solos, max solos, and then go and compete exactly at that. Like, she had a point fluctuation in competitions of maybe a point or two out of a 40-point solo she'd be with. I'd be able to predict usually within a half a point where she was going to end up in a competition, because she was just completely consistent all along this line. I'm trying to think if I have a current student that does this. The closest would be Jessica. Jessica's had a few injuries, so there's been a few little dips, but generally speaking, the solo gets better day to day, week to week, month to month. It's not likely you're going to see a solo today and in 2 weeks come back and see a worse solo. It's very likely you're going to see a better solo. The same tends to go for interpretives, no matter who does the interpretive. The interpretive doesn't really have any jump. At this time, you risk elements, no jumps or spins. So it tends to follow kind of the same progression where you fine-tune and kind of improve little things here and there, and the solo should get better and better and better and better and better, and then be executed pretty close to the best it's ever been in competition. So that's the second fairly rare, I'm going to call that fairly rare. Like I said, Emily's the only one who regularly applied to that. Now I have another one. This applies to maybe 3 of my kids. I think I mentioned in the last video. But I'm going to deal with a previous kid. I had a competitor, somebody in pre-novice ladies years ago named Shannon, who would basically was unpredictable in practice. Now she did tend to get moody and really pressured herself going into competitions, but she would literally be like, from day to day, I would have no idea what kind of solos she was going to do, and she very rarely got a string of solos together that were consistent. So even a month before with a finished solo, I would have her doing her worst solo, and then the next day her best solo, and then an average solo, and then her best solo, and then a worst solo. I mean, it would just be all over the place. The interesting thing about her, and I kind of have the same feeling with a couple of my current kids, is they have very selective memory. Everybody tends to have selective memory. And I don't terribly mind if my kids have somewhat selective memory. But you can't just pick your 10 best solos and ignore all the worst ones that are interspersed with them and say, that's how I'm going to skate in competition. That's my goal. That is ridiculous. In fact, in the case of Shannon, it was so sporadic that I couldn't even say an average. I couldn't say you're most likely to do this. I mean, at any point, she could have been within that entire range, which for her was the difference of a 40 solo to a 26 solo. It was like a 14-point swing between her best and worst solos. She didn't tend to miss her spins, so that guaranteed the 26. But the jumps would be either mostly good or not very good. And you know, the amount of clean top solos she did was not particularly heavily weighted compared to the worst solo she did. It was basically evenly weighted all the way through, which makes it super, super difficult to, you know, plan it for any placements or results or point totals or anything like that. That didn't stop her from doing that, from posting expectations into events, but I couldn't do it very much. You know, I did mention to her occasionally, if you skate clean, you should be around 40 points, which would put you maybe third or fourth in some of her last competitions. But I didn't particularly mention to her that, yeah, you've skated clean one out of your last 20 solos, so don't, you know, you've got basically a 5% chance to actually do that. Um, so that's kind of the second type, or maybe the third type. The fourth type is a little more, I'd say the second most common type, which is that you generally go up, maybe fluctuate a bit, and what happens is you end up having, you know, I said the average is somewhere in the middle, um, which is really very rarely the case. It's far more likely that your average is going to hit some kind of point where you generally, like in this particular case, you can see most of the dots run along this line. And once you get to a certain point, you're likely to dance around a certain line where you're missing one or two elements per solo or something like that. So you're getting about 80% of your max, the max value that your program was developed for, and you're sticking there, and that kind of stays there no matter what. Now, the difference in training more, getting more ice time, putting more stresses in, is you might be able to slightly push that line up, you know, every couple weeks if you have the time. And you also might tighten up the variance so that you're getting that 80% most of the time instead of dipping from, you know, 75 to 85. Like, for instance, I mentioned with Madison currently. Madison's average solo is actually probably right about here. She usually does a very, very good solo. Like, from, if you take the last 20 solos she's done, her worst solo is not that bad, but she's missed a spin and maybe a jump and maybe stumbled in a couple other places. And then her best solo is a clean solo, which is great. That's what you want. So she's getting absolutely 100% value out of her solo most of the time. But a bunch of the time, she would miss one axle, or somebody would get in her way and she'd bail out of it, or something like that. So one axle was missing, which is this line, was the, I'd say, you know, maybe 60% of her solos were along that line, 80%, and then maybe 30% were 100%. Ooh, I shouldn't throw numbers like that out. If you divide the likelihood of what she's going to do in competition, she's 60% likely to do this, 30% likely to do a completely clean solo, and then 10% likely to do anything, probably even less than 10%, to do something worse than her average solo. And this is the way most people tend to go. Now, the line might not be here. The line could be generally bad, could be generally high. Some people stress out at solos, trying to get the music on time, trying to get the timing on, trying to think about everything just kind of overloads them, and they just can't handle it, so they end up with a low performance level all the time, and that's kind of their average. But generally speaking, you know, people don't actually average at the 50% mark. They usually average somewhere else, depending on the kid, depending on their ability to perform, depending on their ability to be musical and creative and crap like that, and execute technique properly. The last type, and I only have one of these that I can think of, maybe two. The last type of performance I can think of off the top of my head that I have currently is the kid who follows the same normal path. You know, they're generally following the normal curve where they're getting less improvement over time, but inching closer and closer to a perfect solo. And my thought is going in, okay, well, most of their solos now are here, so that's where they're going to be. But due to the stress of competition, and because all of these last solos that were generally the best solos kind of aren't implanted heavily into their heads. It's kind of a new thing that they're doing, and it's not a reflex. It's not something they do unconsciously. They end up reverting to a place about 2 to 3 weeks before. So you'll get a solo that's been worse than any of the solos they've had in the last 2 weeks, but about what they were doing 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks ago. They kind of, regress to a period where they had a few other mistakes and bring those back. Now, the only skater I've had do this is Nina recently. Not at this competition, at a previous one. I think it was last year at one point. She ended up regressing 3 weeks, and not being able to get some of the recent improvements we'd had in. I'd say Rachel does this occasionally too. But a fair amount of kids do. You know, if you have a couple, this is why it's not good to work on new jumps the week of competition. Even if you get them and get them in the solo landed, the chances of you actually doing that under stress and not reverting to an older period where you weren't doing that new jump is super high. So we don't like to try to cram new changes in the last week or 2 weeks. You should hopefully be holding steady 2-3 weeks before an event, so that even if you regress 2 weeks, you still have a really good solo going. I guess there are two other kinds. I should have kept that line in there. You know what? Let's just draw this line in, because this line is pretty consistent for everyone. That's kind of the line of progress most people have, and some people have more variance around the line, but it generally gets better and then slows down in improvement over time. So the two other kinds I can think of, which I've had recently, even at this competition, I had a couple people do this, is let's say we didn't have enough time to get the solo to even off with solid performances. Let's say we get here. It's quite possible for some kids to make that final leap themselves and actually have the solo and the performance go up a bit, be the best solo they've ever done, just based on the fact that their rate of learning, their rate of improvement increases at the competition. The stress doesn't bother them. They manage to increase that rate of improvement along the arc. And I had another one. The last example is, what was the last example? Well, I mean, obviously I don't have this, so I don't have to worry about this, but I'll mention it. Let's say your average most of your performances are here. It's possible you can have a total mental breakdown at a competition and end up completely bombing and ending up skating down there or lower, getting a worse total than you could ever imagine at the event. I've only had one kid that does that occasionally. Most of my kids don't do that ever. I'm missing another normal one though. What was it? Arc improvement. I don't know. Can't be that important if I forgot it. Anyway, so those are the examples of the way people tend to skate in competition, and this is where coaches have to have a fairly long relationship with skaters to figure out exactly what their reaction is to competitions. Do they continue the arc and improve the solo? Do they stay exactly consistent, which is my preference? Do they vary a little bit side to side, and how much do they vary from their best performance? Will they fall apart under pressure? Will they do better under pressure? Will they just hold it together exactly as they do in practice? In practice under pressure. Oh, that's what I forgot. There is one difference, which I've had once this year. There is a possibility, like I mentioned the regression, there's a possibility that you'll bring back mistakes that you solved back here in your final performance. You'll think they were fixed, and then no, they regress and end up bringing up old mistakes. But there's another really, really weird thing, which I find happens more on test day than in competitions, and that's that they throw in, they're trying, you have a kid who's trying extra hard, who's trying to do extra push, trying to do stuff they don't normally do in practice, trying to overdo things, and they end up adding in new mistakes in competition, completely unexpected, untelegraphed mistakes that you don't know how to deal with. I don't know how to deal with because they've never come up before. Like they'll start doing some weird techniques or some weird new thing with their arm or their head or their leg that they've never done before, that they've never indicated they were going to do at any point. Makes it very, very, that's probably the worst scenario. That's the only one that my students do occasionally that makes me a little bit angry. Because there's nothing I can do as a coach to prepare against that. There's nothing I can do to really adjust very well at a competition to that. Now, to a certain extent, I'm used to dealing with unexpected stuff. So I do something with it. But the only thing I can do in a competition is, you're doing weird stuff on that. Stop doing that in the warm-up, and hopefully that will work. So that's it. That's the various ways that people react to competition pressure and solo training. Bye.